I was sipping my morning tea on the porch when I first saw the Bulldozers, two massive yellow machines parked right at the edge of my runway, their engines still warm. For a second, I thought it was a mistake. Maybe some roadwork crew lost their way. But the freshly printed sign hanging off the nearest fence post cleared all doubt. Future site of Willow Oaks Community Park. Access denied. By order of HOA President Karen Whitmore. My hands froze around the cup. That wasn't just some empty patch of dirt. That was my private airstrip, built with my own hands, on land my grandfather had farmed before I was even born. It was registered, surveyed, and cleared for my personal aircraft, which I used not just for flying lessons but also to transport supplies across my remote farmland. Blocking it wasn't just inconvenient. It was a threat to everything I ran here. I marched straight down the dirt path in my boots, dust kicking up with every angry step. No one from the HOA had contacted me about this. No permit, no notice, nothing. And as far as I knew, my land wasn't even part of their stupid community. That's what I'd made sure of when I bought the property. I wanted space, freedom, and no nosy neighbors telling me what color to paint my barn. Karen Whitmore had been trying to change that ever since she got elected as HOA president. She lived in one of those fancy houses built a mile down near the new gated section, big windows, trimmed hedges, artificial lawns. Her idea of rural charm was a scarecrow decoration from a department store. Mine was 200 acres of real soil, cows, crops, and the sound of my small engine plane taking off at sunrise. 3 weeks ago, she showed up on my doorstep in a spotless SUV, holding a clipboard like a weapon. She smiled like a cat sizing up a bird and told me she was offering me membership into the Willow Oaks HOA. I politely declined. She insisted. Said my land bordered the community, and it only made sense to join for shared standards and mutual growth. I said no again. That was the last time we spoke until now. I took pictures of the bulldozers, the signs, the blocked runway, and the torn-up grass. Then I made the first of many calls. The sheriff's office said it was a civil matter. Code enforcement said they didn't have any active projects in my area. The FAA rep I'd spoken to before told me if the airstrip was obstructed intentionally, it could qualify as interference. I made sure to note that. But the real problem wasn't the machines, it was the message. Karen wasn't just playing dirty. She was trying to force my hand. A week passed. Then another. I filed formal complaints, mailed certified letters, even flew my drone over the blocked runway to document everything. No response. Instead, HOA volunteers started showing up on the edges of my fence line, snapping photos, inspecting things, and leaving passive-aggressive flyers in my mailbox about suggested landscaping improvements. My hay bales were unsightly. My barn's paint was fading. My scarecrow was unapproved decor. I didn't even live in their jurisdiction, and still they acted like I was a squatter on their land. Then things got personal. My 12-year-old son Eli, who helps me on the farm and has more brains than most of those board members combined, went missing. One moment he was feeding the chickens, the next he was gone. I searched the property like a madman. Fields, silos, under the tractors. No sign. His phone was still on the kitchen counter. I called the sheriff, and they sent a deputy out. But since there were no signs of forced entry, no evidence of a struggle, they filed it as a possible runaway. Eli wasn't the type to run away. He loved the land, loved our life, and hated anything to do with Willow Oaks. I knew something was wrong. I couldn't sleep, could barely eat. I sat by the porch all night, shotgun on my lap, praying I was wrong. The next morning, I found an envelope tucked into my mailbox. No stamp, no return address. Just my name written in big, blocky letters. Inside was a folded printout of an HOA community newsletter. On the front page, a photo of my blocked runway. Below it, in bold red font, uncooperative neighbor refuses to join. Association taking further action. On the back, scrawled in black marker, still think you don't need us? I felt cold all over. That wasn't just a threat. That was a message. Eli was gone, and someone wanted me to know it was connected. I stormed down to the HOA office. If you could call a fancy cottage next to the tennis courts an office. But of course, Karen wasn't there. Her assistant gave me the runaround. Said the newsletter had been digitally edited, and that someone must be spreading rumors. No one had any idea where my son could be. That night, I got another envelope. This time, it had a USB drive inside. I plugged it into my laptop and nearly smashed the screen when I saw the footage. It was grainy, from a camera I didn't recognize, but clear enough to make my blood boil. Eli, sitting in a small room with no windows, wearing the same clothes he had on when I last saw him. He wasn't hurt, but he wasn't free either. And in the background, taped to the wall behind him, was a poster from the Willow Oaks HOA annual gala. That was the moment I knew. This wasn't about rules, appearances, or even power. This was a war. And Karen Whitmore had just made it personal. I sat for hours staring at that video, every second burning into my brain. Eli wasn't crying or panicked, but I could tell he was confused, maybe scared, trying to stay calm. That's how I raised him, tough and sharp. But no kid should be locked in a room like that. I couldn't tell where he was, but I noticed a few details. The overhead light flickered like those cheap utility bulbs, and the floor was concrete with dark scuff marks, like it was a maintenance room or storage area. The camera angle was fixed, likely mounted in a corner. Whoever sent it didn't include any demands, no note, no message, just the footage, like they wanted me to stew in it. But I wasn't the type to sit back. They wanted a fight. They were about to get one. I copied the footage, made backups, and hid the USB in a hollow space under a loose floorboard in my barn. Then I contacted a friend of mine, retired military, runs a private security outfit now. His name's Carter, and we served together in disaster relief missions years ago. He owed me a favor. I didn't tell him everything, just enough. My son's missing. I have reason to believe he's being held by someone local, and I need discreet eyes on Willow Oaks. Within hours, he had 2 plainclothes guys driving loops around the area, checking dumpsters, alleys, security routes. That evening, they spotted something strange, an unmarked white van pulling into a service entrance behind the Willow Oaks clubhouse, the same clubhouse that hosted HOA board meetings, neighborhood events, and, according to public records, recently had a utility shed added to the back. That addition wasn't there a month ago. I drove out under the cover of night, parking on the edge of my property and walking through the woods that bordered the development. I knew those trees like the back of my hand. When I reached the back of the clubhouse, I saw it, a prefab-looking shed bolted to the main building. One tiny vent on the side. No windows. A chain and padlock on the front. The whole thing reeked of secrecy. I circled wide, careful not to trigger any motion lights, and snapped photos. I spotted 2 cameras, one over the back door and another near the shed. Both pointed out, not in. Someone didn't want people getting close, but they weren't worried about who was inside. That told me Eli might still be in there. I was about to retreat when I heard voices, 2 men arguing near the other side of the building. I ducked behind a pile of mulch and listened. One of them said, "Karen says we only hold the kid until Monday. After that, we're done. She's expecting the old man to cave before then." The other replied, "Hope so. I don't like this. He's not just some farmer. He's dangerous." They walked off, their words sticking in my head like nails. Monday. That gave me 2 days. And they were right. I wasn't just a farmer. I owned every inch of the land Karen thought she was queen of. What she didn't realize was that 2 years ago, I had quietly bought the remaining parcels that wrapped around the Willow Oaks community. She thought her HOA controlled the land, but the only thing between their perfectly trimmed lawns and total legal disaster was me choosing to mind my business. Until now. The next morning, I made my move. I gathered every deed, title, zoning certificate, and survey map I owned. I built a digital package and sent it to the county office, triggering a land usage review. Karen had built community trails, gardens, and even the back end of her future park across land I owned. Without permission, without permits. Then I sent a quiet tip to the local news anonymously. They love a scandal, especially when it involves rich people breaking the law on someone else's soil. Within 6 hours, reporters were poking around the neighborhood asking questions. Karen tried to shut them down, but the footage of her yelling at a reporter in front of the clubhouse gate made it onto the 6 p.m. segment. I was just getting started. I filed an official trespassing notice against the Willow Oaks HOA, citing multiple instances of land encroachment, unauthorized construction, and harassment. My lawyer, a quiet old man named Walter with the mind of a wolf, hand-delivered the notice to Karen's doorstep. That same night, the bulldozers were gone, towed away under cover of darkness. But it was too late. My airstrip was still damaged, and Eli was still missing. Karen must have realized things were heating up, because by the next morning, the shed behind the clubhouse had vanished. Literally. The whole structure had been disassembled and removed overnight. The only thing left was a patch of disturbed soil and tire tracks. My security team didn't see a thing. Whoever moved it knew what they were doing. That should have broken me, but it didn't. It just shifted my focus. If she moved Eli, I needed to find the next likely location. I checked every empty property Karen's HOA had access to. One of them stood out, a foreclosed model home at the edge of the development, listed for sale but sitting empty for months. According to public utility records, the water and electric had been turned back on just 4 days ago. My team scoped it out. No visible activity, no lights, no movement. But there were fresh tire marks leading to the back. I waited until dusk and made my approach. The back door had a new padlock on it, but I came prepared. I cut through it with bolt cutters and slipped inside. The house was cold and empty. No furniture. Just one room in the back with a closed door and faint buzzing, like a fluorescent bulb. I opened it slowly and felt my heart skip. Eli was sitting on a cot, bundled in a blanket, eyes wide. He looked up at me and whispered, "Dad." I rushed to him, wrapping him in my arms. He wasn't hurt, just shaken. They'd fed him, kept him clean. But they never said why he was taken. He only saw one woman the whole time, described her as having sharp eyes and long red nails. That matched Karen to a T. I called Carter and got him out through the woods while I stayed back, planting a hidden camera in the hallway before I left. I wanted faces, names. I wanted proof. By dawn, I had what I needed. The footage showed a man in a black polo unlocking the door and stepping inside with a tray of food. His face was clear. I ran it through facial recognition software Carter had access to. It matched a former private investigator who'd been hired for harassment claims in a nearby HOA. Now I had names, evidence, and a reason to burn everything Karen built down to the ground. I didn't go to the police right away. I knew how these things played out. Karen had money, influence, and a web of neighborhood allies who'd vouch for her innocence before even hearing the accusation. And if the police botched it, the whole thing could fall apart. I needed to make this bigger than her backyard politics. I needed to make it public, loud, and impossible to cover up. So I built a case. Every photo, every recorded conversation, the footage of Eli locked in that model home, the list of fake violations, the signed land deeds showing how she'd built on my property without permission. I packaged all of it and sent it to a local reporter named Maya Trenton. She was known for cracking into corrupt town councils and shady property deals. I gave her everything under a pseudonym, along with one sentence: an HOA president kidnapped a boy to pressure his father into joining the association. That same day, Maya called me using a burner number I'd left in the email footer. She didn't ask who I was. She just said, "I've been waiting for something like this." Within 48 hours, her story exploded online. The headline was brutal: "Power-hungry HOA president allegedly kidnaps child in land dispute." It included images of the private airstrip blocked by bulldozers, legal maps showing my property boundaries, and blurry stills of Eli inside the locked room. Karen's name was splashed across every major news outlet by noon. By sunset, satellite trucks lined the gated entrance of Willow Oaks. Residents were stunned. Reporters knocked on doors. Parents who once proudly sipped wine at Karen's garden parties now demanded answers. That night, a special HOA meeting was called, but the clubhouse was empty, locked tight, its windows dark. Karen had vanished. The red Range Rover was gone. Her house sat quiet like no one had ever lived there. But I wasn't worried. People like Karen always try to run when the spotlight hits. They never get far. Meanwhile, I sent Carter and one of his guys to quietly track down the man from the hallway footage. His name was Douglas Reeve, a washed-up investigator who had lost his license 2 years ago and was scraping by doing dirty jobs for dirtier clients. It didn't take long to find him holed up in a motel 2 towns over. When Carter's guy knocked on his door, he didn't resist. In fact, he looked like he hadn't slept in days. The fear had already set in. They didn't threaten him. They didn't need to. Just told him that federal agents were involved now, and if he wanted a lighter sentence, he better talk. Doug broke fast. He admitted everything. Karen paid him in cash, instructed him to keep the boy somewhere clean, quiet, and without bruises. Said it was temporary leverage. Doug handed over texts, burner numbers, and even a location where Karen was supposed to meet him for the final payout. An abandoned greenhouse just outside the HOA's reach, hidden behind rows of citrus trees left to rot after the county shut down a farming co-op. I didn't wait for law enforcement. I went with Carter and 2 more guys, hiding in his blacked-out SUV parked in the trees near the greenhouse. At exactly 9:15 p.m., headlights cut through the orchard. Karen's Range Rover rolled in, slow and cautious. She stepped out, wearing black this time, no pearls, no HOA badge. She carried a folder under one arm and a purse clutched tight in her hand. We let her approach the building. Then we moved in. I stepped out first. She froze. Her eyes widened when she saw me. For a moment, her mouth opened like she might say something, but all the arrogance was gone. I told her everything was recorded. Her face, her voice, her payments, the illegal structures, the kidnapping, the threats. She didn't argue. She just lowered her head and muttered that she never meant for things to go that far. I told her that didn't matter anymore. She walked into the greenhouse, knowing what was coming next. We turned her over to the sheriff's office at sunrise. By then, news crews had already caught wind of her location. Cameras flashed as deputies led her away in cuffs. She kept her head down, hair covering her face. The charges came fast: unlawful detainment of a minor, conspiracy to commit coercion, abuse of power, falsification of legal documents, and trespassing on federally registered land. The feds got involved when it came to the airstrip and FAA violations. It turns out blocking a private airstrip with construction machinery, especially without clearance, wasn't just an HOA rule-bending stunt. It was a breach of federal aviation laws. Now the Department of Transportation and even the FBI were looking into how far Karen's reach had gone. The fallout inside Willow Oaks was immediate and chaotic. Board members scrambled to distance themselves from her, claiming they had no knowledge of her actions. But leaked emails told a different story. Some had approved the fake citations against me. Some even joked about the stubborn farm guy and his ugly little plane. By the end of the week, 4 of them had resigned. One was fired from his job after his company found out about the discrimination complaints. Residents who once ignored me at the feed store now showed up at my gate with casseroles, apologies, and questions about how they could help fix what had been broken. But the damage ran deep. Eli was home now, safe and recovering, but not the same. He slept with the light on and jumped whenever a car slowed down on our gravel road. I let him be. We sat on the porch a lot those days, quiet, side by side, looking at the airstrip. It was clear again, clean, but I hadn't flown since that morning before the bulldozers came. Something about it didn't feel right yet. I knew the day would come, though, and when it did, I wanted Eli in the seat beside me. The land was still mine, every inch. And now the county had opened an investigation into HOA zoning corruption across several developments Karen had worked on. My story had triggered something bigger. Neighbors from other towns began reaching out, sharing similar tales of harassment, bullying, and quiet threats from self-righteous board presidents. A senator even tweeted about the case, calling it an alarming abuse of power hiding behind neighborhood rules. I'd never planned on becoming the face of anything. I just wanted my son back and my land left alone. But once you stand up and win, people start looking to you to help them do the same. I didn't turn them away. 2 weeks after Karen's arrest, the landscape around Willow Oaks began to shift like a thaw after a hard winter. Her house was listed quietly, stripped of all signs that she'd once ruled the neighborhood like a monarch. The front garden was dead, her prized flagpole was gone, and the HOA board was in complete disarray. The remaining members tried to salvage what they could, issuing formal apologies, appointing a temporary president, and attempting to rebrand themselves as a more community-friendly organization. But it was too little, too late. The press hadn't let go. Neither had the authorities. And I wasn't about to. Karen's court case was just the beginning. During the investigation, it came out that she had falsified expense reports, used HOA funds to finance private surveillance on my property, and even tried to bribe a local zoning officer to reclassify parts of my farmland. The officer came forward, handing over emails and voice messages. That revelation lit a fuse. Suddenly, the story wasn't just about kidnapping and land disputes. It was about corruption at the very roots of neighborhood governance. 3 more developments she had managed were placed under review. A federal task force was created to examine abuse of power within private community boards, and they used my case as the model. Meanwhile, something strange started happening at my own gate. People began stopping by, not just to apologize or bring food, but to ask for advice. Some were local, residents who had been too scared to speak out while Karen ruled the HOA. Others drove in from nearby towns, even different states, hoping to learn how to protect their land from HOA overreach. I'd never imagined becoming some kind of local hero, but I couldn't turn them away. I started keeping folders of documents, scanned copies of zoning rights, land ownership guides, and step-by-step processes for how to challenge HOA decisions legally. I gave everything for free. It wasn't about money. It was about making sure no one else went through what Eli and I had. But just as things started to feel normal, another twist came that I hadn't seen coming. A letter arrived at my mailbox, old-fashioned and sealed in wax. Inside was a formal notice from a private development firm. Turns out the land beneath Willow Oaks, the original parcel that the fancy homes were built on, had a legal loophole buried in its past. Decades ago, my grandfather had leased the mineral and access rights to a company that no longer existed. But when I inherited the property, those rights passed to me. Karen and the developers who built Willow Oaks had never checked the deeper legal layers. They'd built on land they didn't fully control. And now that Karen's legal team was off the table, the firm that originally tried to buy my Airstrip years ago was circling again. They wanted to offer me a deal, to buy out the mineral rights quietly and avoid litigation. I declined. Instead, I brought in my own lawyer and a quiet team of researchers. What they found stunned even me. Not only did I own the mineral rights, I had partial control over water access infrastructure and soil conservation routes used by the HOA's internal plumbing and sprinkler systems. That meant they couldn't legally maintain their community's irrigation system without negotiating terms with me. In other words, the same land Karen had tried to bully me over now held her entire kingdom hostage from beneath the surface. I had every reason to press them, but I didn't want revenge. I wanted change. So I gave the interim board a choice. Work with me to create new, fair community bylaws that respected landowners and non-members, or risk lawsuits that would bankrupt the HOA and freeze all maintenance projects for months, maybe years. They chose the first option. Together, we drafted new agreements. The HOA was forbidden from enforcing rules beyond its formal boundary lines. Landowners who weren't members couldn't be fined, cited, or harassed. New board members would be required to undergo ethics training. Eli, now acting like himself again, suggested an idea I hadn't considered, a community review council made up of both members and non-members, with voting power to challenge unfair board actions. The interim president agreed. The whole thing was passed unanimously at the next open meeting. It was a small step, but it meant something. And then, another twist. A woman showed up on my farm one morning, maybe in her early 60s, wearing faded jeans and boots worn thin. She introduced herself as Marlene Whitmore, Karen's older sister. I braced for drama, but it didn't come. She told me she hadn't spoken to Karen in years, not since their father passed. But when she saw the story on the news, she felt like she needed to say something. Apparently, Karen had always been obsessed with order, rules, perfection. As a child, she once tore down Marlene's blanket fort because it violated room layout standards. Marlene handed me a photo, an old one of their family farm, now long gone. She said Karen had always hated messes and anything unpredictable. That fear had grown into something toxic, something she unleashed on anyone who didn't fit her mold. Before she left, Marlene said she was sorry for what her sister became and what she did to my boy. That night, I took Eli for a walk down the runway. We watched the sky turn orange and pink as the sun dipped behind the hills. For the first time in months, he looked peaceful. I told him the plane was ready again, fixed, fueled, and waiting for its next flight. He smiled and nodded, said he was ready too. So the next morning, just after sunrise, we climbed in together. The wheels rolled over smooth gravel, past where the bulldozers once sat. The engine hummed, the wings lifted, and soon we were rising, the farm shrinking beneath us. From above, the fields looked like a patchwork quilt, green, gold, brown. And far in the distance, Willow Oaks was just a quiet cluster of rooftops. No louder than the wind. No bigger than a shadow. We were about 300 feet in the air when I looked down at the land below and felt something shift inside me. That land had been the battleground, the witness to everything from Eli's disappearance to the chaos Karen unleashed. But from above, it didn't look like war had ever touched it. Just rolling earth, familiar rows of crops, a barn that stood like a memory, and the faded trails of a once-blocked runway now reclaimed by our own wheels. I should have felt peace, maybe even pride. But something didn't sit right. The story was too clean, too wrapped up. I knew enough about people like Karen to understand they didn't go down easily, not without trying to pull one last thread loose on their way out. And I was right. The first warning came in the form of a letter, hand-delivered to the county recorder's office and flagged for urgent legal review. It claimed that Karen had secretly transferred partial easement rights to a shell corporation 2 days before her arrest. This shell company, Pinefront Holdings, now claimed it had access routes cutting straight through my farm, using obscure legal language buried deep in an annex subdivision clause. It was a final play, one made in desperation, but one that could cause real problems if ignored. The intent was obvious. Even from jail, Karen had tried to lock her claws into something. The paperwork was slick, almost professional. Almost. That's where she slipped. The legal description of the access route referenced coordinates that didn't line up with anything in the county maps. Carter helped me bring in a land survey expert, who quickly realized the coordinates were copied from a different property, one that didn't even exist anymore, demolished in a flood control project a decade ago. That one mistake cracked the whole fake claim wide open. I gathered every title deed, zoning record, survey map, and municipal plat tied to the fake transfer and walked them into the courthouse myself. The clerk, a sharp-eyed woman named Rosie, knew the judge handling land disputes personally. By the next morning, Pinefront Holdings had its fake claim revoked and was flagged for investigation. Karen had tried to steal land from jail. Now she was facing attempted fraud on top of everything else. But while the legal system played catch-up, another storm was forming, this time from inside the HOA's own ranks. A faction of residents, mostly ones who had benefited from Karen's rule, began organizing. They called themselves Preserve Willow Oaks and claimed the new reforms I had helped install were weakening the community. They wanted a return to traditional standards, demanded the HOA board retract the land use agreements, and accused the current leadership of being manipulated by outsiders. I knew what that meant. It meant me. They put up signs, sent mass emails, even hosted a town hall on the tennis courts. Their leader? A man named Gregory Vance. I remembered him clearly. He was the one who used to glare whenever Eli rode past the HOA playground on his bike, as if a farm boy didn't belong there. Gregory was smart, but not smart enough to cover his tracks. A local journalist leaked a recording of a closed-door meeting where Gregory laid out his plan to reclaim influence and build pressure on county zoning officers. He wanted to make life difficult for anyone who didn't fall in line, including me. The community backlash was swift. Dozens of residents, fed up with years of quiet fear, rallied around the new board. They held a vote, and for the first time in the HOA's history, a group of residents from outside the official development lines were allowed to attend as observers. The vote passed by a landslide. Preserve Willow Oaks lost its momentum overnight. As for Eli, he started drawing again, detailed pencil sketches of barns, runways, plains. He sketched maps of the farm, the fields, and even a funny caricature of Karen standing on a stack of HOA manuals while being blown away by the propeller of our little plane. His sense of humor had come back, quiet but steady. One afternoon, I found a note on my workbench. It was from Eli. He wrote that he didn't want to forget what happened, but he also didn't want it to be what defined us. He wanted to start a farm camp, a place where other kids, especially those with no land of their own, could come and learn how to grow food, fix tractors, and even fly if they wanted. I stood there for a long while after reading it. My son had survived something dark, but he came out of it with light in his hands. And then came the call I never expected. A woman named Dana from the state attorney general's office reached out. She said they were working on policy reforms to regulate HOAs across the state and wanted to include my case as a central example. They were drafting new protections for non-member landowners and new restrictions on how far HOA authority could stretch beyond its borders. They even invited me to speak before the commission. I wasn't the public speaking type, but this was different. I didn't talk about laws or court dates. I told them about my son, the Bulldozers, the missing boy in a locked room, and the neighbor who thought she could own people the way she owned property. I told them what it felt like to stand on your own land and feel like a stranger. When I finished, the room was silent. The reforms passed with bipartisan support 2 months later. By fall, the farm camp was up and running. We started small, just 6 kids, mostly from nearby towns, all curious and eager. They built scarecrows, planted lettuce, and helped me patch up old fence posts. On weekends, we took them up in the plane. Just short, careful flights over the land, showing them what it looked like from above. One of the boys asked if we could fly over Willow Oaks. I nodded. As we passed overhead, I looked down at the neatly arranged streets, the tiny HOA clubhouse, and the rooftop where Karen once planned her empire. From up here, all her power looked like nothing more than a pattern on a patch of dirt. Eli leaned over and whispered, "Looks peaceful now." And it did. But peace doesn't grow on its own. You have to plant it, fight for it, and make sure no one tries to bury it in concrete again. I never thought refusing to connect to the HOA's overpriced water supply would make me a target, but I learned the hard way that defying their control came at a cost, one I could have never anticipated. The moment I stepped onto my land that morning, expecting to draw fresh, cold water from my farm well, I felt my stomach drop. A sickening layer of hardened gray concrete sealed it shut, a brutal, irreversible violation of everything I had built. The weight of realization crashed down like a tidal wave. This wasn't some minor dispute. This was war. And the enemy? My own HOA, led by none other than Karen, the self-righteous dictator who believed she had the final say over every inch of property in the community. I clenched my fists, rage boiling beneath my skin. How far had they gone to make their point? And what else were they planning to do? The memory of my refusal played in my head like a bad movie reel. Karen had shown up at my doorstep with her usual condescending smirk, offering me the exclusive opportunity to connect my farm to the HOA's central water system, for an outrageous monthly fee, of course. My well had provided clean, natural water for years. I didn't need their overpriced, chemically treated alternative. I turned her down, polite but firm, and I could see the twitch in her eye, the barely contained frustration at my refusal to comply. She had warned me, in that sickly sweet tone of hers, that independent resources could cause complications with property compliance. I hadn't thought much of it then. Now, standing before my destroyed well, I realized exactly what she meant. I dropped to my knees, running my fingers over the rough, dry surface of the concrete, feeling the grit scratch against my skin. This wasn't just about water. This was about control. The HOA wanted every resident to bend to their rules, to be dependent on their overpriced utilities, to pay whatever fees they demanded without question. And when someone dared to resist, they made an example out of them. I was their latest lesson. But what they didn't realize was that I wasn't the kind of man who rolled over and accepted defeat. A deep sense of violation settled in my chest as I surveyed the damage. They had done this in the dead of night, while I slept peacefully in my home, unaware that just yards away, someone was sabotaging my land. My farm relied on that well. My livestock depended on it. I had built this place with my own hands, poured my sweat and soul into making it self-sufficient. And now, thanks to Karen and her gang of power-hungry enforcers, I was standing in the middle of my property feeling powerless. But only for a moment. The anger hardened into determination. They wanted to push me into their system, force me into dependency. That wasn't going to happen. I wasn't just going to fight back. I was going to expose them. There had to be a legal boundary they crossed, a violation of my property rights that would hold up in court. And if I had to dig through every single HOA bylaw, county regulation, and property deed to find it, I would. But first, I needed proof. A sinking feeling settled in my gut as I pulled out my phone and scrolled through the security camera app. My heart pounded against my ribs as I clicked on the footage from last night. The screen flickered before showing the grainy, black and white view of my property. And there, right in the center, was a group of figures, moving in coordinated precision. A truck, a cement mixer, the unmistakable outline of someone standing with arms crossed, overseeing the operation like a queen surveying her kingdom. Karen. I exhaled sharply, my grip tightening around the phone. This wasn't just some petty act of vandalism. This was premeditated, calculated sabotage. And now, I had the evidence to prove it. The footage played on loop in my mind, every frame burning deeper into my anger. Karen and her enforcers had crossed a line they could never walk back from. Destroying my well wasn't just a petty act of revenge. It was an attack on my livelihood, an attempt to force me into submission. But what they didn't realize was that I was already steps ahead. I knew this game, and I wasn't about to let them win. My first move was to secure every piece of evidence I could. I transferred the footage to multiple devices, backed it up on the cloud, and emailed it to a lawyer friend who owed me a favor. The law wasn't always on the side of people like me, but I wasn't going to give them the chance to brush this off as a simple dispute. This was destruction of property, trespassing, and sabotage, crimes that carried serious consequences if the right pressure was applied. But first, I needed to see the damage up close, to understand exactly what they had done and how far they had gone to make their point. I stepped outside, the crisp morning air doing nothing to cool the fire in my chest. The well was the first thing my eyes locked onto, an unnatural slab of gray cutting through the natural earth like a scar. The concrete had settled overnight, dry and solid, meaning they had done this at least 6 to 8 hours ago, long before dawn. They had planned this down to the last detail, knowing I wouldn't notice until it was too late. The cement was thick, at least a few feet deep, meaning breaking through it wouldn't be easy. But even as I stared at the destruction, my mind was already working on the next step. There was always a way to fight back. If they thought this was enough to force me into their overpriced system, they were about to learn how wrong they were. I grabbed a shovel and slammed it into the ground near the edge of the well, testing the depth of the seal. The sharp clang of metal against concrete echoed through the empty field, a cruel reminder that brute force alone wouldn't be enough. They had made sure of that. My options were limited, but I still had one advantage: knowledge. Karen might have thought she could manipulate her way into control, but she underestimated one thing. I knew this land better than she ever could. This wasn't just a plot of property to me. It was something I had built, cultivated, fought for. And that meant I knew every loophole, every legal protection, every county ordinance that might tip the scales in my favor. I turned back toward the house, mind already racing through my next steps. I needed professional confirmation of the damage, an official report stating that this was an illegal act of destruction. HOA rules were often a gray area, but property laws weren't. If I could prove they had no legal authority to tamper with my well, I could make sure they paid for every ounce of concrete they poured. But it wasn't just about that anymore. It was about making sure they never did this to anyone else, that no one else in the neighborhood had to wake up to find their independence stolen out from under them. The real question now was how far they were willing to go. If this was their first move, what was next? They had already trespassed onto my land, vandalized my property, and tried to strong-arm me into their system. Would they stop there, or had I just become their newest target? The thought made my jaw tighten. If Karen thought I would back down, she was about to learn that some people don't just fight back. They make sure their enemies regret ever starting a war in the first place. The weight of what had happened settled deeper as I walked back to the house, my boots grinding into the dirt with every heavy step. This wasn't just an inconvenience or a minor setback. It was a deliberate move to push me into compliance, a calculated display of power meant to remind me that I was under their control. But Karen and her cronies had made a mistake, one they wouldn't realize until it was too late. I wasn't the kind of man who folded under pressure. If anything, this only hardened my resolve. I grabbed my phone, scanning through my contacts until I found the number I needed. A local contractor I had worked with before, someone who knew the laws around private wells, and who wouldn't be intimidated by the HOA's influence. If I was going to fight this, I needed facts, hard evidence that would hold up in court, not just accusations that Karen could dismiss with her usual smug arrogance. The sound of tires crunching against gravel snapped my focus back to the present. A black SUV rolled to a stop near my fence, and my stomach tightened with suspicion. I didn't need to see the face behind the tinted window to know who it was. The HOA's enforcers never wasted time once they decided to make someone their problem. The door swung open, and a figure stepped out, moving with the practiced authority of someone who thrived on intimidation. A clipboard in hand, the kind of official prop they loved to use to justify their nonsense, as if a piece of paper could override property rights. My hands clenched at my sides as I watched them scan my property, their eyes lingering on the well as if admiring their handiwork. They didn't come to negotiate or apologize. This was a victory lap, an attempt to rub salt in the wound and remind me that they were in control. But what they didn't know was that I had already started preparing for my counterattack. I forced myself to stay still, to let them make their move first. The way they carried themselves, the slow, deliberate steps, the way their gaze flicked between the well and my house. It was all part of the same tired intimidation routine, the kind of performance they put on to make residents feel small, powerless. But I had seen enough of their tactics to know that their power was built on fear, on the assumption that people would rather comply than fight back. They expected me to fold, to accept my punishment, and quietly hook into their water supply like a good little resident. But what they didn't realize was that some people don't just fight back. They make sure their enemies regret ever starting the battle in the first place. I didn't move as they surveyed the damage, scribbling notes onto their clipboard, likely crafting whatever excuse they planned to use to justify this blatant act of sabotage. HOA bylaws were intentionally vague, riddled with loopholes designed to trap homeowners into compliance, while giving the board unchecked power to enforce whatever ridiculous mandates they wanted. I had seen it before. The way they twisted regulations, used technicalities to threaten people with fines, even manipulated property values to push out anyone who didn't conform to their vision. But they had never gone up against someone like me, someone who had spent years studying the fine print, picking apart every clause and condition, ready to throw their own rules back in their faces. The enforcer lingered by the well, tilting their head as if considering their next move. They didn't know I had security footage. They didn't know I had already contacted a contractor to assess the damage. And they sure as hell didn't know that I was already drafting my legal response. Their confidence was built on the assumption that I wouldn't dare fight back, that I would roll over like the rest, too tired or overwhelmed to challenge their authority. But I wasn't just going to fight. I was going to make sure that when this was over, Karen and her little army of rule enforcers wished they had never stepped onto my land. The enforcer took their time, pretending to inspect the damage as if they hadn't orchestrated it themselves, scribbling notes that meant nothing, only serving as a reminder that they believed they held all the power. I watched from a distance, my blood simmering with barely contained fury, but I refused to give them the reaction they wanted. This wasn't just about their control over my well. It was about setting an example, proving that anyone who defied them would pay the price. Karen had likely sent them here to gauge my response, to see if I would storm out, demand answers, give them a reason to paint me as the aggressive, unreasonable one in the eyes of the community. But I knew better. I had already started setting my own pieces in place, and soon, they would realize they had pushed the wrong man too far. The enforcer lingered a few moments longer before finally turning back toward the SUV, their job complete for now, satisfied that their message had been delivered. I stayed still as they drove off, my mind racing with the weight of what needed to be done next. The evidence was solid. The security footage was undeniable proof of their trespassing, their deliberate sabotage, and I had already contacted an expert to document the damage. But that wasn't enough. I needed to hit them where it hurt, not just legally, but publicly. HOAs thrived on maintaining a facade of order, of legitimacy. They relied on residents being too intimidated or too exhausted to fight back. If I wanted to make a real impact, I needed to turn their own tactics against them, expose them in a way they couldn't ignore or brush under the rug. I walked back toward the well. The dry, lifeless concrete, a sickening reminder of how far they were willing to go to enforce their control. But as much as it angered me, it also fueled my resolve. I wasn't just going to dig another well or find a workaround. That would be too easy, too much like a surrender. No, I was going to make them undo what they had done, make them sweat under the weight of their own corruption. And I knew exactly how to do it. The first step was making sure the authorities got involved, not just with a simple complaint, but with a documented case of property destruction. The second step was exposure, taking the fight beyond their carefully controlled HOA meetings, beyond the rigged complaint process they had weaponized against homeowners. I needed the entire neighborhood to see what they had done, to make sure Karen's reign of control cracked under the weight of her own arrogance. I spent the next few hours gathering everything I needed, organizing my case down to the last detail. Every clip of footage was categorized, showing each stage of their crime, from the moment they rolled onto my land to the last drop of concrete sealing my well shut. The legal paperwork was already in motion. My contractor had agreed to provide a professional assessment of the damage, and I had begun drafting an official complaint to the county. But that was just the beginning. The real fight was about to start. And if Karen thought she could silence me with a slab of concrete and a veiled threat, she was about to learn just how wrong she was. By the next morning, the wheels were already in motion, and I could feel the weight of what was coming, a storm building just beneath the surface. The legal complaint had been filed, the evidence secured, and the contractor's official report confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't just vandalism. It was a calculated act of destruction, one that violated multiple property laws. But I wasn't naive enough to think that filing a complaint would be enough to make the HOA back down. Karen and her board thrived on bureaucracy, hiding behind technicalities and twisting rules in their favor. If I wanted justice, I needed to make sure they had nowhere to hide. So I took the next step, the one they wouldn't see coming. I compiled everything, every document, every video, every legal code they had violated, and I made it public. A detailed, indisputable account of what they had done, posted everywhere. Social media, local news tip lines, community forums, anywhere that would shine a light on their corruption. And I knew it was working the moment I saw the first ripple of panic spread. Within hours, my phone was buzzing nonstop, messages pouring in from neighbors, some horrified, some hesitant, some whispering their own stories of harassment and intimidation. People who had been too afraid to speak up were suddenly finding their voices, realizing they weren't alone in their struggles against the HOA's suffocating grip. And that was exactly what Karen feared the most. Control only worked when people believed they were powerless, when they thought they had no choice but to comply. But now, with undeniable proof of what had been done to me, the carefully constructed illusion of authority was beginning to crack. I watched as the community started pushing back, asking questions the HOA wasn't prepared to answer, demanding explanations that Karen couldn't twist into her favor. But even as I saw the tide turning, I knew better than to think they would give up without a fight. The first sign of retaliation came quickly. A formal violation notice delivered straight to my door, listing a laundry list of fabricated infractions. Karen was scrambling, trying to reassert control, trying to paint me as the problem. But she didn't realize I had anticipated this move. I had already forwarded everything to my lawyer, ensuring every action they took from this point on was documented, every false claim a new piece of evidence against them. And just as expected, the pressure only made them act more recklessly. The next evening, I caught another HOA enforcer skulking around my property, phone in hand, snapping pictures as if searching for anything they could twist into another complaint. But this time, I was waiting for them. The moment they stepped over the line onto my land, I had my own camera ready, capturing every second of their trespassing, every desperate attempt to fabricate a case against me. They weren't just trying to enforce their rules anymore. They were trying to cover their tracks, to intimidate me into silence. But they had already lost that battle. The breaking point came when the local news station picked up my story. A segment exposing the HOA's corruption, the unlawful destruction of my well, the growing number of residents coming forward with their own experiences. The community was watching now, and Karen couldn't spin the narrative in her favor. The very authority she had wielded so ruthlessly was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. But I also knew that desperation made people dangerous, and Karen wasn't the type to go down quietly. If this was how far she was willing to go to enforce her control, I had to be prepared for whatever she would try next. The storm I had been preparing for finally arrived, but not in the way I expected. Karen had made one last desperate attempt to regain control, a move so reckless that it sealed her fate entirely. Late at night, I heard the sound of heavy tires rolling onto my land, the unmistakable hum of an engine idling just beyond the fence. I had set up motion-triggered cameras after the first act of sabotage, and as soon as the alert pinged on my phone, I knew she had sent her enforcers for one final act of intimidation. But this time, I wasn't just watching. I was waiting. The footage showed them creeping toward the well, as if somehow undoing the mess they had created would erase the evidence of their crime. But what they didn't know was that I had already called the authorities. The moment they stepped onto my property, they had crossed the line from HOA harassment to criminal trespassing, and this time, there would be consequences they couldn't manipulate away. The flashing red and blue lights cut through the darkness as the sheriff's department arrived, their presence a stark contrast to the arrogant confidence the HOA had displayed before. The enforcers froze, caught in the act with no plausible excuse to justify why they were lurking on private property past midnight. Karen hadn't come herself. Of course, she was too smart for that, preferring to pull the strings from a safe distance while letting others take the fall. But it didn't matter. The officers weren't here for just another civil complaint. They had reviewed the evidence I had provided, and now they were dealing with an actual crime. I watched as the enforcers were questioned, their attempts at deflection growing weaker with every passing moment. The law had finally caught up with them, and this time, there was no twisting the truth to escape it. By the next morning, the entire community was buzzing with what had happened. Karen had gone silent, her once overbearing presence nowhere to be found. The HOA board members who had stood by her side were now scrambling to distance themselves, issuing weak apologies and half-hearted attempts to explain away their involvement. But the damage had already been done. The neighborhood had seen the truth with their own eyes, and the illusion of power Karen had spent years building had crumbled into nothing. The county had opened an official investigation into the HOA's financial practices, and reports of shady dealings, misused funds, and illegal property violations were surfacing faster than they could be buried. It wasn't just about my well anymore. This was the beginning of something much bigger. The community had been living under the weight of Karen's control for too long, afraid to speak up, afraid of the consequences. But now, the fear had shifted. She wasn't the one in control anymore. She was the one being watched, scrutinized, held accountable. And the realization of that was more satisfying than I could have imagined. As for me, I had already started the process of undoing the damage they had done. A new well was being dug, this time with reinforced protections that no one would be able to sabotage again. The legal battle was ongoing, but I had no doubt how it would end. Karen had overplayed her hand, pushed too hard, and now she was the one facing fines, lawsuits, and the very same legal system she had tried to weaponize against me. I had won, not just the battle for my property, but the war against the corrupt grip she had held over the neighborhood for so long. And as I stood by the fresh construction site, watching the first streams of water break through the earth once more, I knew one thing for certain. She would never be able to take anything from me again.